which raises questions about vaccinations for the number of people to get them to make antibodies. The goal shouldn't be so much to try to prime you for when you get infected, but to treat you when you get infected and to treat the inflammatory thrombotic response if you get COVID-19. There's a lot of terms used about the efficacy of vaccines, and you should know three terms. The relative risk reduction. This is what you've heard so much about, the 95%, the 94%, the 65%. This is how many people got diagnosed with COVID in the vaccinated group versus the people who got diagnosed with COVID in the non-vaccinated group. There's a more important term for you to understand, and that's absolute risk reduction, which is a comparison of those groups that says, what's the real difference between those groups? And we're going to look at those numbers as well. And then there's the number needed to vaccinate, which is how many people would you have to vaccinate to try to reduce one person from being diagnosed with COVID. These are what you hear about. So what does vaccine efficacy mean? It really means, when they're saying this number, that they're looking at the number of people who got vaccinated and then were diagnosed with COVID. This is one example from Pfizer, compared to the people who did not get vaccinated who got diagnosed with COVID. And when you do the math, it gives you 0.05. 1 minus that number tells you vaccine efficacy. You multiply it by 100, it gets you percent. So how did they decide who made the diagnosis of COVID? Well, you had to have two things. You had to have a positive PCR test, and you had to have a set of symptoms. Now, Pfizer's group is that group. The symptoms that are there are the same symptoms you would get with any infection. Viral, bacterial, fungal, tuberculosis, and in some cases, cancer. It's not very discriminating. Moderna, same problem, same issue. Again, I know they're small. You can download them, read through them. They're what you would normally have for symptoms. Aches and pains, muscle discomfort, diarrhea, cough, runny nose, that type of thing. Your body's letting you know something's wrong. And Janssen, this is Johnson & Johnson. The company that makes it is Janssen. That's why I refer to it. This is a Belgium company, which, by the way, Belgium pulled this from the market. So, you got those two things, you got a diagnosis of COVID. So let's look at the actual emergency use authorization documents. And if we look at Pfizer's to begin with, and we do what they just asked us to do for vaccine efficacy, you'll find in the confirmed cases that 8 people who got vaccinated were diagnosed with COVID. Okay? In the non-vaccinated group, 162 got diagnosed with COVID. And you do the math, and it comes up with a 95% efficacy. But you're not asking how often you're going to get COVID. Your question is, will it prevent me from getting diagnosed with COVID? Will it prevent me from dying from COVID? So let's look at the data. Their data, not mine. If we ask for confirmed COVID cases, you'll see that in the vaccinated group for Pfizer, there were 17,411 people. There you go. 8 people were diagnosed with COVID, which leaves you with 17,403. It gives you a value. Non-vaccinated, there were 17,511. 162 were diagnosed with COVID, which leaves you with 17,349 who did not develop COVID. Those are the numbers. If you're a scientist like me, you don't just look at those numbers, you statistically analyze them to ask a question, is there any real difference between those two groups? And it turns out that when you do that, there's not. It's not statistically different. But looking at that more important number, what was the absolute risk reduction? Well, remember this? 0.93 minus the difference in those vaccinated gives you an actual absolute risk reduction of 0.88%. If you ask if it cut down on the risk of death, well, here's the data. Page 41, Pfizer had 2 deaths, no vaccine group had 4. And what does this say? There is no statistically significant difference in the numbers of deaths, and they represent what is seen in the general population. So Pfizer, no statistical difference whether you got vaccinated or not, and no change in deaths. Let's look at Moderna and do the same thing. These are the emergency use document presented to the FDA that resulted in their being granted EUA clearance. COVID diagnosis, 11 people with COVID in the vaccinated group. Whoops, back that up. Richard, not so fast. In the non-vaccinated group, 185 over here gives you a vaccine efficacy of 94%. Okay? Same thing we do with Pfizer. Now let's look at the likelihood that it's not going to cause COVID, because that is, after all, the goal. So in the vaccinated group, there were 13,934 people. There they are. 11 ended up with COVID, which leaves you with 13,923. That's the rate. Non-vaccinated group, 13,883. 185 with COVID, therefore 13,698 did not. It is amazing what you can find if you go into the documents and dig. But you have to dig. Is there differences between those groups? No, there isn't. And more importantly, the absolute risk reduction, you saw 1.33% ended up with COVID diagnosis. That's there, minus 0.08% in the vaccinated group, and your efficacy is 1.25%. The absolute risk reduction. Deaths? Well, here they are. 6 in the Moderna group, 7 in the no vaccine group. And as you can see, again, the statement, there's no statistical difference. And it's what you would expect to see in this many people in the general population. This is my favorite vaccine because it gives us a little bit more view into what's really going on. Because they use